Bienvenue à toutes et à tous aujourd'hui, ce 15 janvier, à ceux qui peuvent se joindre à nous pour ce deuxième mini-colloque intitulé « Questions socialement vives ». This series of mini-symposium aims to explore and unpack the many issues facing teaching of French and teaching in French in Canada. Un premier mini-colloque s'est tenu le 4 décembre. Il s'est penché sur les questions liées au marché du travail de l'enseignement du français, y compris le recrutement international et les bonnes pratiques d'intégration et de partage des connaissances pour soutenir le recrutement et la rétention des enseignants dans ce domaine éducatif. Le mini-colloque d'aujourd'hui, le 15 janvier, explorera les enjeux liés à rendre l'enseignement en français plus inclusif et collaboratif pour tous les acteurs dans le domaine. Donc, je vais commencer aujourd'hui. J'ai le plaisir d'être la modératrice de la première table ronde de cet après-midi qui a pour objectif de réfléchir sur how leaders can support success across all FSL programs, comment les dirigeants peuvent appuyer, soutenir le succès dans tous les programmes de français dans leurs établissements ou dans leurs conseils scolaires. On vise bien sûr avec cette réflexion aujourd'hui à sensibiliser les décideurs dans les conseils scolaires à la vraie nature des programmes de FLS et à l'importance de leur rôle comme soutien des acteurs clés dans la communauté éducative. Donc, cette table ronde s'adresse bien sûr aux directeurs, enseignants, parents, élèves et du réseautage, et bien sûr comment ces dirigeants peuvent soutenir toute cette communauté. J'ai le plaisir d'être avec moi aujourd'hui Josette Bosc, qui est une enseignante passionnée du Conseil scolaire catholique de Ottawa. Josette has been a passionate FSL teacher educator for 2 decades. She has recently completed 5 years at FSL 712 educational consultant for the Ottawa Catholic School Board and is now delighted to be back in the classroom teaching at the intermediate level. So you can see that with some administrative position, she'll be very much able to give us her insight on the questions on how leaders can support success across all FSL programs. She's a past president of the Ontario Modern Language Teachers Association and is currently involved in the development of a series of the professional learning series, Dare to Unmute, a series of modules focused on meeting the needs of diverse learners in FSL classroom. Josette currently sits as well on the executive of the Ottawa chapter of Canadian Parents for French, as well as the National Conference Planning Committees for the Association Canadienne des Professionnels de l'Immersion and the Canadian Association for Second Language Teachers. With me again, donc welcome Josette, et merci d'être sur ce panel et cette table ronde cet après-midi. Nous avons également Angeline Humber. Angeline is Vice President of OMLTA and a teacher consultant for Greater Essex County District School Board. In her role as teacher consultant, she supports French as a second language, FSL program, K-12, and the early years, birth to age 8. I was actually so happy to see the term birth. I thought, wow, this is very promising. She has been an educator for 23 years and has had experience working in core French and French immersion classroom. Angeline collaborates with colleagues with her board as well as regionally, provincially, and nationally to build capacity and advocate for educators, students, and programs. And Jordan Sloan. Jordan is the bilingual literacy coach, donc coach en littératie bilingue for the Renfrew Catholic District School Board, and like Angeline and Josette, is connecting to many network and through her current and past administrative position, really has a lot to say about how leaders can support success across all FSL. Oh, here is Jordan. Magic. Nice to see you, Jordan. So I'm moderating this roundtable, and I will start with the first question for all of the panelists. So we know that in all Ontario schools, the majority of students are or will be at some point enrolled in an FSL program pathway. Despite this reality, the FSL programs continue to encounter systemic barriers, with increasing challenges in recruiting and retaining educators for these programs. To all of you, I am asking, what are some considerations and actions that could lead to eradicating those barriers? So who wants to start first?
I think I get to start on this one. Can you
Jordan, yes, we want to hear your voice.
All right, so the increasing demands for FSL programming have been handled differently by boards throughout the country. However, what remains are the challenges to both recruiting and retaining qualified FSL teachers. So in November of 2021, ACPI, the Association Canadienne des Professionnels d'Immersion, and CASALT, the Canadian Association for Second Language Teachers, released the results of their study to measure the state of French language teacher shortage. And they suggested that there's a deficit of about 10,000 qualified FSL teachers to meet today's demand. Bilingualism is increasingly valued by Canadian families, which is reflected in the continual growth of FSL programs. But with this momentum, it's essential that we do support the teachers that we are recruiting once we're able to get them. We're seeing more and more FSL teachers recruited directly from teacher training programs, and they aren't going through the rigors that are often faced when beginning a career in education. New teachers gain a great deal of experience in programming as well as in classroom management by working through the system as occasional teachers. They see the work of others, they experience different grade levels, they face a wider variety of students, they get to try everything out, and their learning from university becomes real as they gather those skills and competencies to be more marketable. But with the high needs that we're facing now, teachers are not gaining that hands-on experience. Not only are we facing that lack of experience, but we're also seeing a shifting mindset in new teachers due to the qualifications that they hold. So in the past, a new teacher would have had to spend perhaps several years gaining experience, facing unexpected classroom experiences. And I think maybe in a sense, we're taking away that experience from new teachers. We're taking away that chance for them to gain experience with that immediate hiring. Totally understanding that that's the need and that's the need in the system, but it's presenting us with the challenge of how to best support those teachers without the background that we as leaders and coaches and consultants maybe have had ourselves. I wonder that if in removing this early rigor that new teachers face, we're removing that desire to be lifelong learners. So not only would new teachers or would teachers in the past have gained experience as occasional teachers, but they would have also taken courses and participated in workshops with the goal of being more marketable. New teachers would have spent a great deal of time preparing for each day with their understandings of the things they'd learned and experienced. So all that said, yeah, we're experiencing a very significant challenge with recruitment. However, we also need to be aware of the teachers that we're recruiting and the needs that they're bringing to the table so that we are able to help them grow in their teaching roles and then retain them.
So Angeline or Josette?
So I would like to speak now. Thank you very much. And in addition to what Jordan has mentioned about the recruitment process, another consideration that we need to take into account for eradicating barriers is the retention piece. So when someone is hired, what are we as boards able to do or leaders able to do in order to retain those educators in those positions? And I know in our conversations, we've really talked about highlighting the value of the French as a second language educator as part of that learning community in everything that we do. That I'm thinking particularly of our core French educators that have had relationships with families and students over time. So they've known sometimes students since in some boards, core French starts in kindergarten. In our board, it starts in grade 4. But through those years, the value of those relationships and considering those relationships with other staff, I know that that's an ongoing piece. So ensuring that all of the staff feels that sense of community and sees that value of French as a second language. Some of the considerations could be even the IPRC process. So are all educators considered in their valuable voice that they might have for that? Individualizing IEPs, so those individual education plans, are they really part of that process, and it's not just kind of a blanket statement given to all, and really looking at approaching everything from a student by student and educator by educator basis, and including all of those voices at that table. One thing we need to do is consider those professional learning opportunities that are provided, and not only providing them, but helping, as Jordan had mentioned earlier, helping people see the value in being lifelong language learners. And it doesn't need to necessarily be a professional learning opportunity connected directly to French as a second language learning all the time. Sometimes it's seeing yourself in that learning process. I know I myself was part of a collaborative inquiry in critical literacy in the early years, and I, as a French immersion educator, wasn't sure that it would apply to me. So I had to kind of self-advocate for myself in that role and show how it could apply in my program. Actually, I say the early years, a lot of the educators were primary, so not only was I immersion, but kindergarten also. And then I think really in my role as teacher consultant, I try to encourage my colleagues in French as a second language to advocate for the value of what they do every day. So that is essential, and it's not always evident to others how valuable what they do is. So it's that self-advocacy piece, and showing that you are valuable in diverse roles in the school. So looking for opportunities even outside of the classroom that can highlight the value of who you are and what you do to the students, the educators, and the community.
And Josette, in the Ottawa region, what does it look like?
So just to build a little bit on what Angeline said, I think she made a very important point that it's essential, and we've seen a lot of research around this in recent years, the value of learners and educators seeing their place in the school community. So I'd invite you to consider when you walk into a school building, if it's an immersion school, if it's a bilingual school, again, going back to Dominique, what you raised in the question of the fact that all of our students at some point will be part of an FSL pathway. So in all of our schools, there are FSL programs being offered. And so when you walk into that school, what do you see? How do you see that FSL program being valued in the school? How do you see the teachers who are teaching that program, as well as the students who are enrolled in those pathways, really having a presence? Often when we walk into our schools across the province, we see a lot of physical signs on the walls and through the building on what the school values. So we might see posters, we might see pictures of mascots, we might see trophy cases with different awards. So the question is really, what are the signs when you walk into a building that an FSL program is being run in that building, and that at that FSL program, the educators in the program, as well as the student participants, are valued in that program? So if we think about, there are very small actions that educational leaders can take that can have a large impact on how the school community values those programs. If we think about something as simple as when we're making morning announcements, when we're choosing music to encourage students to go to class, when we're choosing our national anthem, are we including French in that planning? When we're rolling out things like posters for different initiatives around the school, when we're having themed weeks, are we making a space in there to recognize that we have bilingual pathways in our buildings? Are we thinking about when we're doing things like staff planning and allocating of space and allocating of resources, are we putting the needs of those FSL pathways high on our priority lists? So it's really about flexibility. We know that resources are in short supply. We know that there are many demands on a school, but if we want to say that we value our FSL teachers, we want to recruit them and retain them in our buildings, then I think it's essential that we have a space that values, where they can see their value, they can see their important role in the school community. There have been situations in different boards where it becomes an either or. Either you have access to this program or you have access to an FSL pathway. And so what we're encouraging today for leaders to consider is that idea of not an either or, but how can we come together as a school community, as a school board, and really search out those creative and innovative solutions so that instead of being an either or, it's an and. It's an extra pathway. It's something that's valued and that we put a priority on. And I know Jordan has a wonderful example of how her board has worked to offer opportunities to students in that. and also rather than an either or?
Yes, so we have a school actually with a very significant Algonquin population. And the administrator at that school felt that the Algonquin language should be valued in the same way that the French language was valued, and therefore removed that need to choose between them. So set up the scheduling so that all students were able to participate in FSL programming. So Algonquin language is being offered at an alternative time than the FSL. And this required that all the teachers in the school be on board in order to accommodate those students that wanted to participate. But it worked to best meet the needs of the students. That school also started strategically using the time that they have with the teacher of Algonquin language. So there are quite limited Algonquin teachers around. And so in order to have that plurilingual language exposure to as many students as possible, the Algonquin language teacher actually works with the kindergarten gym program. So they have now a French teacher, an Algonquin teacher, and an English ECE educator in for that 30-minute block several times a week. Because Algonquin is a strongly verb-based language, it really works well in that context. So that's just another example of how the children are learning and using language authentically and how they're best making use of that time with that educator.
I really appreciate examples because it really gives clarity to the offers that you are actually making to the leaders. So I understand that it's no longer the or, but it has to be an and I totally agree with that, Josette. We talk about like the choice question, but let's say that the leaders have made the move and like in Jordan's school have actually implemented those measures so that there is no longer to make a choice between one program or another, but they can actually encourage people to do both. We know that all of the leaders have lots of responsibilities, and I would not even mention them in times of pandemic, but so with all of their responsibilities in their role, they have made that decision. Now, we all know it is challenging for leaders to have a strong understanding of the components of a quality French as second language program. So now it's how can they themselves assess or know that once they have made the choice of aligning their programs, that these programs will be of good quality. What key information should leaders consider? I'm asking the questions to the four of you. And what resources are available to support them in their roles to be able to understand what a quality French program looks like?
I'd love to start off this conversation. I know in our school board, we have had significant shifts and turnover in our administration. So with a great deal of brand new administrators and is particularly in our French immersion schools. But as again, I go to my point is all of our schools have French as a second language. So supporting the administrators in that has been really critical. So the first thing I think that's really important is for administrators to reflect on their own background experience and with French as a second language and how that may impact their mindset. So what has happened in their past experience with French as a second language, whether it be in school or with educators in their building, that has impacted that mindset, and understanding that there may be some bias towards it, and what can we do to kind of remove that bias and support the French as a second language programs in our building. Another piece that's really critical is many administrators don't have that second language, so they may not speak French. So how can they support when that is not something they do? So really looking at the barriers that are there and doing everything we can, again, to eradicate them, as we mentioned earlier. One thing too is when working with educators, being able to value the strengths that they have and look at areas for growth. So how can we best support those areas for growth? I know some of the things that we've talked about are educator proficiency. Again, if you're not a French speaking administrator, how can you support the development of that proficiency or help educators seek out opportunities to develop their proficiency? And then of course, pedagogy, not trying to develop a stronger understanding of what pedagogy, what second language acquisition looks like. So there are multiple resources available that we'll mention in a bit that can help administrators look at that. And of course, examining and considering equity for your expectations of educators. So using the same high standard for educators in all programs, just because it is French. I know I've had some conversations with administrators that feel not comfortable necessarily evaluating and holding the same high standard of educators. But I think it's really critical that we do everything that we can, or seek out supports to do so. I know I'm often called in my role as teacher consultant with some questions about, I saw this, is that what it's supposed to look like? And also looking for resources and those sorts of things.
Well, I really like the fact that at least they sometimes are aware and they know who to ask for. But you brought the questions of the resources. So who wants to, Jordan, please.
That's me. So there are lots of great resources to support leaders working with FSL teachers, particularly when they themselves don't have that background in additional, whether it's second language or additional language learning. The Ontario Modern Language Teachers Association, the OMLTA, has created some look-fors for a CFR, so the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages classroom. And that really will outline what an outsider should see in a language classroom and subsequently help to guide that conversation, that discussion with teachers. So for example, walking into the room and seeing that French is the language of communication between the teacher and students as well as between students. Emphasis on developing oral proficiency, students exposed to authentic texts, grammar being taught in context, amongst other things. And there are look-fors also created, they were co-created at the January 2014 CFR provincial meeting. And those are intended to support those conversations about professional learning and refining practice. And so those look-fors are broken down a little more into planning and assessment strategies, teaching and learning strategies, and resources and support. Another great place to look is Transforming FSL, so transformingfsl.ca, and there's a link right in there to resources and support specifically for administrators of FSL programs. And within that link, you'll find a link to From Awareness to Action, which is resources for principals and vice principals. And so some specific FSL type issues would include things like supporting new teachers of FSL, or pathways to FSL in grades 7 to 12, supporting conversations about student learning, increasing engagement, and more. Another great one is CASALT, the Canadian Association of Second Language Teachers. They have created a reflective guide for school administrators. And ACPE, the Association Canadienne des Professionnels d'Immersion, has an administrators page on their website with links to their resource, a reflective guide for French immersion leaders that was created with Gordon Campbell and colleagues. There's a blog. They have a dedicated stream at their annual conference for administrators, and they are working on a job search website called jobimmersion.ca to help with that recruitment. Finally, another one worth mentioning is the OPC, the Ontario Principals Council, and they have a module series for administrator learning specifically geared towards French immersion and towards core French. So there's a multitude of resources out there, but these are a couple of great places to start.
Josette, do you want to contribute to that list, or?
I would be delighted. What I'd like to actually invite administrators to consider as well is to look at the larger school and community base to say, who are our allies? So as many strong administrators know, it's impossible to have answers to all of the questions. And the most effective thing that you can do as an administrator is to build your network. So when you run into those questions, when you have those challenges, when you're looking for support, you have a large network of people that you can go and speak to. And so, again, Jordan gave some wonderful examples, and I would highly recommend that as administrators, you just start gently looking into those different resources, but also take a look at, as Angeline mentioned at the start, you have teacher consultants in your board, you have department heads, you have people who are informal leaders in the building. So it's really about taking a look at who are all the actors in your network. Are there people on your parent council? Are there organizations and associations in your community? So who are all those people, and how can you bring them in and have them really play a role in supporting you to support the needs of your FSL educators. So it's not about the administrator necessarily needing to have those language skills, but can they bring in someone who does have the language skills, who does have the pedagogical background in order to effectively support the teachers in the building? It's also those ideas of how, when we're facing things like limited time for instructional leadership as an administrator, how are you creative? How do you create opportunities for your FSL educators to come together, to collaborate, to support one another? Can you go larger than your school community? Many of our Ontario schools have 1 or 2 FSL educators. So how can we go larger into our district, into our area, into our province, and create opportunities for those educators to connect and engage in professional learning dialogues? And even how can we go beyond the associations and beyond our school board and really give our FSL educators an opportunity to connect to researchers? If you look at the University of Ottawa, there's some wonderful work being done on really looking at what does an effective administrator in an FSL context look like? And what are the key things that those administrators can do to support the people within the building? So there really is a large network out there. It's a matter of tapping into all of those resources and knowing who can you call in different situations. The administrator doesn't need to do it all. They just need to really think, again, going back to what we said in the first section, how can you think creatively to build those connections and build those opportunities in order to most effectively support the needs of the educators in your building?
Thank you, Josette. And I appreciate, Jordan, for you to answer the chat as well in putting the names of the association for which you can look the links on the internet. You mentioned, Josette, and actually Jordan, you're talking about transforming FSL. Those administrators have now, we heard, access to different resources and organization, and the networking seems to be key. Now, they are themselves, we hope, transformational leaders. And how can they support now the professional learning conversations and opportunities for their own teachers that they are supposed to lead and guide and mentor, or at least care about? I'll be saying that word, which I think is important. So how can they, what kind of consideration effectively support FSL program and educators? So how should they, might they support those professional learning opportunities? Who wants to start?
So I'll start off on this one if I could. So one of the things that, as we were preparing for this, we discussed is it really is a mindset shift. And so it's a matter of taking how you look at your FSL educators in your building and realizing that these are language and literacy specialists. So as you're looking at planning different initiatives, you're looking at the needs of your building, recognize that you have these language and literacy experts in your building. So value the role of those educators. And one of the ways that you can show them that you value that role is bring them in very early in the planning process for different initiatives and things that you'd like to run in your building. So take those specialist educators. And if you're saying we see a need for literacy development in an area in our building, can we bring those FSL teachers in at the start to say, we know that what you do in your classroom looks a little bit different from other classrooms. So what are the unique ways that you, as the specialist educator, see that you have the ability to support these initiatives that we'd like to move forward on within our building? There's been a couple of times in my career that I've had wonderful opportunities. One was looking at early on that idea of planning by design, so backwards planning. And so what our board actually did was they took the English classroom educator and the FSL educator, and they said, we understand that it's very important to reinforce concepts and skills in a cross-curricular way. So rather than saying we're going to send one educator, we're going to send teams with the English and the French educator out to work on this process so you can really collaborate and spend time discussing how to best support students from both sides. What does it look like in the English language setting? What does it look like in the French language setting? So it's really coming back to that idea of aligning initiatives and saying we have these outstanding experts in our building. how can we create a situation where their expertise is valued and when they're brought in early in the planning process, so they can really, as the experts, provide some guidance into how they are best able to support different priorities and initiatives.
I like the word collaboration and conversation that you brought in your reply. I'm sure Angeline or Jordan can add a lot regarding the concept of collaboration and conversation.
Well, and to extend on that example, I know in my role as teacher consultant, I am constantly advocating for, as Josette mentioned, aligning those initiatives. I know in our program meetings for our program department, when we get together, the minute I raise my hand, my superintendent knows I'm going to say, but we need to consider French along the way. Our school board has over 25% of our schools offering French immersion, and we know that all of our schools are offering French as a second language. So if we're doing something, for example, putting out a resource or something, French shouldn't be an afterthought. It needs to be thought of along the way. That way it maximizes the power of those resources. And as an administrator, I need to consider the individual learning needs, the strengths of my educators, as Josette mentioned, as literacy and language specialists, but also respond to those learning needs. So consider that the possibility for diverse collaboration. For example, on a PD day, it might be really beneficial to have that language and literacy expert at the table as part of the school community, but there may also be opportunities, particularly for core French educators where they feel isolated, for them to work together and develop their professional practice on an ongoing basis, and even their proficiency through gathering together. So really considering each unique situation and what the best, most responsive way is to meet the educator learning needs at that time. Another piece of that would be, I know for French immersion, the ability to, a lot of their focus has been specifically on mathematics of late, or the science of reading. So how are we making sure that they're having opportunities to learn about those really important pieces, for example, the Common European Framework of Reference, and so that they are able to support the best pedagogy that they can.
Thank you, Angeline. Jordan?
So I get to share more resources with you. The resources that I mentioned previously really do support the administrator learning, whereas this has more of a lens towards supporting leaders in their work with teachers. And Josette did share a great link in the chat. The OMLTA has recently created a series of modules with viewers, guides, and videos and webinars designed specifically for those that support FSL educators. So to go through that learning together. And the first set of modules was created in 2020 and was geared around FSL teaching and learning. New series is being released in the next couple of weeks, actually, geared towards the intercultural component, towards identity in the FSL teacher, and has a big focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So keeping an eye out for those through that link. Transforming FSL, again, as mentioned above, and the link in the chat, has a vast repertoire of resources for professional conversations, for teaching, for student learning. I would strongly encourage administrators and everyone to dig deeper into the DELF, into the CEFR, into the DELF training that comes and that's available. Reach out to your FSL coaches and coordinators to find out more. And reach out to your allies, reach out to your supports. As mentioned, Josette mentioned it and Angeline mentioned it, using your coaches, using your consultants, your teacher leaders, bringing your English and French immersion teachers together to plan and to really find the ways to best support the students in the classroom.
So I see that there is one question in the chat. And before we move to the last questions, which is linked with your current initiatives that you are working on, I'd like to read one comment, and it is around the question of accountability. So Shafika is mentioning that teachers should be accountable, student teachers, and I would add administrators. What do you answer to that concept of accountability? Who wants to start?
I'm happy to start with just a thought on that. I think really the way that we move towards reflecting on accountability is we need to have a deep understanding of what the role of teachers, what the role of students, what the role of administrators in a program is. So many of the resources that Jordan and Angeline have mentioned. So things like really understanding as an administrator, what should an FSL classroom look like? What are best pedagogical practices? We know that those have shifted dramatically in the last 10 years since the release of the revised FSL curriculum. We've really called on educators to change, to move almost from being teachers of grammar to teachers of language in authentic and meaningful context. And so if as an administrator, you don't know what that classroom should look like, it's very difficult to be accountable, to be able to support. It's difficult to be able to hold your teachers to a high standard in the type of programs that they should be offering. And so I think really as a starting place, it's that going out and looking at those resources. And there's some very simple starting things, again, as Jordan mentioned, with those look fors, as Angeline mentioned, with that continuum of implementation. Start with those, because if you know what your criteria for success look like, if you have a very clear idea of that, it's much easier to then talk about accountability.
And I think what Josette just said, and I know I already mentioned using those same high standards, but if we can empower educators and help them feel the value in what they do, I think that will perhaps support, because this accountability, the notion of accountability, I know becomes a little sticky, particularly at these times in like demanding. So if we can show the value in inspiring and motivating people to be lifelong language learners and to work to a high standard through empowering, I think that hopefully that would add to that accountability, that sense of holding ourselves accountable for meeting high standards more.
So well-defined criteria and high standard seem to be key in knowing how to understand what actually this means to start with, and then ensuing ways of learning more, so that that knowledge process develop and you really understand the criteria and what high standard means. So I think I've heard many times on this roundtable the notion of life learning. And I think this is a key concept. Like, we are constantly, and we will have to constantly continue learning. So there might be some initiative to think about to kind of make that the goal, the lifelong learning for everybody. I'd like to mention in the resources Camerise, because this roundtable is sponsored by Camerise. Camerise est une initiative donc propulsée par une équipe du collège universitaire Glendon de l'Université York, et qui vise donc à offrir un répertoire de ressources et aussi la possibilité à tous les acteurs de s'engager pour développer cette communauté et ces réseaux. Et je suis donc très contente que Angeline, Jordan et Josette travaillent avec Camerise. Et j'ai beaucoup appris déjà des rencontres que nous avons eues depuis le mois d'octobre. Et c'est pour ça que j'étais tellement impressionnée par votre connaissance approfondie des défis que peuvent avoir bien sûr les administrateurs, mais aussi les autres acteurs, que nous avons donc décidé de mettre sur pied cette table ronde. Pour terminer, j'aimerais vous poser une dernière question. Donc, moving forward, what are some initiatives that you are undertaking to create support, resources, and opportunities for leaders and decision makers to maximize support for French as a second language program? A continuum of processes. Who wants to start?
So I can speak to that first. We're actually delighted that Camerise has offered Angeline and Jordan and I the opportunity to come together. And as you may have noted when we were speaking today, we really talked about the importance of bringing together different stakeholders, different actors in the role of supporting FSL communities. And so one of the projects that we're looking at moving forward on would be an opportunity to bring together teams of diverse teams from school boards. So often we'll have initiatives that look at what are the teachers' needs, or we'll have opportunities for consultants to discuss things. Sometimes you'll have human resources people come together and speak about recruitment and retention. But what we still see in many ways right across education is that idea of siloing. And so what we're looking to do with a project that we'll be moving forwards with in the next couple of months is actually invite school boards to bring forward very diverse teams that might include your consultant, but might also include those principals. It might include someone in this special education field, superintendents, trustees, and also possibly parents, students, and teachers. So really creating an opportunity where those people with different understandings of the program, different stakeholder roles, can come together and share their struggles, but also share their resources and have different voices that can hopefully lead to that idea of those creative and innovative solutions for maximizing the potential of FSL programs within different school boards. And then in order to support that, I think, Angeline, you were going to talk about a tool that we're looking at creating.
So one of the valuable tools that we have already from, as was mentioned earlier, and it was created through innovation configuration process, is the CEFR continuum of practice. And so we know that a lot of administrators are able to use that to better have those meaningful conversations with educators about their practice. But we talked about using a similar process with our focus group discussions and interviews to develop a more in-depth continuum that looks at the inclusivity of French as a second language programs and the pedagogy being relevant and culturally responsive, and ensuring that we're doing everything that we can as stakeholders in French as a second language to ensure that educators are able to provide strong role models for French language acquisition. So we are hoping to use that process to develop some resources and a continuum to support.
Thank you, Angeline. Jordan? I know you're working on the projects, and I know you are excited about it. You have contributed a lot already by your knowledge about the administrators, the parents, the teachers. That continuum, what does it mean for you?
I think like everything was just mentioned from Josette and from Angeline, what we're working through, but just having that piece that's going to support everyone all the way through, support administrators in supporting the teachers that they work with, which is then going to end up being beneficial to all the students.
So I'm really looking forward to working with you to develop this tool, and of course the consultation that we will be able to conduct with all of the different stakeholders. I think that really it's a different type of consultation, and I think the process is really inclusive. From what I have already learned from you and the way the process was used for the implementation of the Cadre Européen. So we'll be able to report on this at some point in the spring, and how successful we managed to engage different actors around the table and what they had to say, so that, to go back to the first question, to support all of the French program in a school is really the responsibility, as was said today, of the administrators, but the teachers, the consultants, the coach. So it's like a big family having to address, how can we make sure that when I walk into a school, I know that this school is vibrant in both French and English, and that students, teachers, parents, administrators are happy to actually support all of these programs. And they may be as well adding other Indigenous languages. So it's, for me, if it's that the school of the future would look in Canada, wow, I'm really looking forward to see that in all of the different school boards. But I'm sure they all will have to learn from one another, and it will be a little step by little step way of doing it. But I'm very happy that this team is really putting all their energy to do it. I think it's a sign that we do want to move forward in addressing, again, all of the challenges that program in French face. And we know in Ontario, but we know it's the same thing all across Canada. And this is why this colloquium is so important, because we have managed to have different institutions across Canada to work together in not only putting this colloquium together, but that comité directeur is already a sign of how collaboration can really move forward, maybe the teaching of French in Canada, or at least in Ontario. So I'd like to thank everybody around this table. So thank you, Josette, Angeline, Jordan, for being with me. And as I said, I'm really looking forward to working with you on this project. I think it's really promising, and we'll have to make a lot of buzz about it as well. So bye-bye, everybody.